So the biochar absorbs those things, and then the animal excretes the biochar through the manure. So it's getting it out of their body. So that keeps them healthier. Now, if an animal's healthier, if it's got better rumination, then it's going to be a happier animal. It's going to use less feed, but it's also going to be happier and healthier. And so it's probably going to breed easier, and it's going to give more milk and better milk. So all of these factors are in the research literature. And so I've kind of put all those together.
Who's coming along to Underground in February? It's New Zealand's most exciting festival of soil, food and farming, and it's once again back at Greystone Wines in North Canterbury. Looking at how things are shaping up, it's definitely going to be an epic couple of days out that you don't want to miss. There's going to be interactive talks on soil health, adaptive grazing, agroforestry and farm planning, plus music, glamping, field walks, and just some incredible food. Honestly, it's a festival for people who like to get excited about topsoil and a really good grazing wedge. This year's speakers include John Chester from The Biggest Little Farm, the man, the myth, the legend, Darren Doherty, and an epic lineup of local legends like Russ and Charlotte Heal, Jodie Roebuck, Nick Gill, John King, and Jules Matthews, plus much more. I'm going to be hosting some talks on the economics of regen transition and ecosystem payments, and as always, helping out with the infield soil sessions. So, Underground Festival is on the 18th and 19th of February 2026, and you can purchase 1 or 2 day tickets that are now live up on undergroundfestival.co.nz. Hopefully, I'll see you there. Welcome back to another episode of the Force of Nature podcast. Today's special guest is Dylan Graves. He's the passionate Pernie, and we're going to talk about a topic that I've wanted to talk about on here on the podcast for a long time, which is biochar. So, Dylan, what is biochar in simple terms, and how do we go about making it?
Hi, thanks for having me on. Yeah, biochar is a high carbon product resulting from a process we call pyrolysis, which is a separation by using heat, and it's separating all the volatiles out of the biomass, and then we burn those, and so it's the black product that's left behind afterwards. There's 3 ways to make it. Mm-hmm. First is called a retort, which is kind of like a container where you put the biomass inside the container. The container has little holes, and then you heat around the outside of that container. So you basically cook everything that's in it, and the gases can come out those holes and then get burnt, and then you get left with that biochar inside the container at the end. The second way is called flame cap, and there's various methods to do this where you burn the biomass, but you keep adding more material as it's getting burning. And so the material is then blocking the oxygen from getting in to the material underneath it. So as it's burning, you just keep adding more, and you build up a whole lot of coals, and then you extinguish those with water later on. And the third main method is a machine. So a continuous machine that's usually using something like wood chips, and those are pulled into the machine, heated up, they off gas, and then the biochar comes out the other end.
Beautiful. So for those that aren't really familiar with biochar, in terms of farming context, why should a farmer consider incorporating this into their system?
Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the properties of the biochar. It's basically a carbon sponge. So it's got very high surface area inside of it, massive surface area, although that does depend on how it's made and what it's made from. But it's that surface area that has certain properties that hold on to minerals, so hold on to nutrients. Also provides a habitat for biology. So bacteria and fungi can go and live inside the biochar itself. The biochar also holds on to water because it's like a sponge, and it also holds on to air. So there's lots of little tubes inside it that can have little pockets of air, but also hold on to the water really, really well. So I guess in a farming context, whatever problem you've got, biochar can be a solution to those problems. And I think we can get into some of those in detail as we go through this interview.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fascinating, I guess you wouldn't call it a product, property that can be brought into your farm system that can solve a lot of things. And that's why I'm so excited to learn from you today a bit more about what biochar can do and the various applications within a farming system. But before we get into that, can you please introduce yourself, Dylan, and share a bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. I'm an immigrant to New Zealand in the mid 90s from South Africa. My family moved over. I finished secondary school for a couple of years, went to uni. I became a maths teacher and did a couple of years teaching on the Kapiti Coast. I then went overseas and worked overseas in 3 different international schools. That was about 9 years, I think. And in the last couple of years, I got into permaculture. When I was living in Asia, living in this big city, I kind of found that even having a really good job and plenty of money and cash and being able to travel and stuff, I still wasn't that happy. So I guess I was looking for a better sense of purpose. Teaching wasn't really doing it for me. So I got into permaculture, and then I moved with my partner to Australia, and we put that permaculture theory into practical experience, doing it on the land, as it were. And I started teaching about permaculture and educating and sharing our knowledge. My wife is a permaculturist as well. She does more of the food growing and kitchen side of things. So she's a fermenter and a baker and a crafter. She's now weaving harakiki and making baskets and all sorts of things like that. So we went in Australia for 8 years, and then we returned to New Zealand 3 years ago. We ended up buying a small farm in Southland 2 years ago. And now we're kind of starting again. We're setting up a permaculture homestead again. We both still continue to teach workshops whenever we can. I work part-time for the Riverton Environment Centre, and I do workshops through them as well. And I also work part-time for an organisation called Biochar Network New Zealand, like 10 hours a month. And I do admin and education and research for them. And basically just trying to get biochar out there to the world and share it and, improve the awareness of it. I think we're really lacking awareness. So the main mission is to get the awareness out there.
Totally. I think there is a complete, not a complete, but it's just a general lack of awareness of what biochar is and how it may be different from someone, like, say, a humate. So for yourself, what really made you get interested in biochar in the first place?
Yeah, it was while we were in Australia. We had very sandy soil, and we used to get quite long dry periods. So we wanted to grow a lot of food, and compost wasn't really doing it for us. It would still kind of dry out, disappear very quickly. Same with mulches. They just kind of oxidize and disappear. And so I was kind of searching for something else, and I found biochar, and I tried it, and it made quite a big difference quite quickly. We had excess fuel loads, we had to basically clear around our homestead pretty much at least 100 meters, try and reduce all the fuel. So, lots of eucalyptus and acacia trees, try and, get all those branches away so that if there's a bushfire, we have a little bit of a protection, And so, it was a perfect solution because we could use that fuel reduction process to make the biochar to then improve our soil. And I started teaching workshops about it as well, and then read a lot of the research, and just the more I learn about it, the more I like it, the more it fascinates me. It can improve all soil. So it doesn't matter if you have real clay soil or have really sandy soil, because it's holding on to that air and the moisture, it improves the structure of a real clay, dense anaerobic soil, but then it also improves the sandy soil by holding on to the water and holding on to the biology. So it's just, for me, it's just a win-win-win. And there is some negativity around biochar, which we'll probably talk about at some point later on. But I think the advantages far, far, far outweigh any potential negatives. And with a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of education, those can be mitigated very easily.
That's fascinating. So in terms of using it to improve your soils, do you need quite a lot of it, or is it something you can add, gradually, yearly? Because, some people do worry about the cost, and I think that's more just around the supply and demand part more than anything.
Yeah, the research shows that as little as 2% can make a difference. So that's 2% per volume. And in volume, I would say probably the first 20 centimeters to 30 centimeters of the soil profile. So 2% sounds like quite a small amount, but per volume, it could be quite a substantial amount. So in general, I think it's quickest and easiest to amend soil where you're going to grow high value crops. So, when we're trying to grow our own food in our homestead and we have our, market garden type beds, then it's definitely worth putting lots in there as much as you can, as quick as you can, because you're going to get the benefits back really quickly. But on a large broadacre scale, yes, you're probably looking at adding small amounts when you can and then building it up over time. The beautiful thing about biochar is that it doesn't decay. So biology doesn't eat it up, as it were, like it does with compost. Compost oxidizes and the living biome in the soil kind of consumes it, uses it up. So you can apply compost and you'll be quite fortunate if you can see the results of it a year later, but certainly not 10 years later, whereas biochar can be there for hundreds to thousands of years. So it's really an investment. You add it to your soil and it's going to stay there, and then you add a little bit more and you add a little bit more, and you're improving it for the rest of your life, but certainly also for your offspring and their offspring, and whoever succeeds on your property, they're also going to benefit from it. So I think it's a fantastic legacy that you can leave for anyone in the future.
Totally. I mean, can you explain more about why it doesn't get broken down, say, so quickly like compost?
Yeah, it's to do with the process of making it. So when you're making it, you're heating it up. So it's made ideally around 600 to 700 degrees centigrade. And when the biomass is heated that much, all the volatiles, like I said, are getting burnt off. They're off-gassing. And then the rings of carbon, it's a six-sided ring of carbon, they're fusing together. So if you get a piece of wood and you make it into biochar, it shrinks in size because it's the carbon skeleton. But that shrinkage is because the rings of the carbon are kind of fusing together. And it's that fusing together that makes those rings then very, very strong. Biology then cannot break those down. The only way to kind of get rid of biochar is to burn it further. Burn it in the presence of oxygen, and then it will go down to ash. So once it's in the soil after it's been made, those fused carbon rings basically are called recalcitrant, and they don't really decay, or they decay very, very, very slowly.
That's fascinating. And I guess one of the things I wanted to talk about with you today was how you can incorporate biochar into a composting process and what that actually does to the compost once you're spreading it as well. Can you tell us a bit more about the benefits that are associated with doing so?
Okay, so the nice thing is that I did a decent literature review on incorporating biochar into composting, because it's one of the things that Biochar Network New Zealand wants to promote, is that anyone in New Zealand doing composting from commercial scale down to your backyard, we want to promote using biochar. The research shows that it benefits that whole composting process. If you aim for 10 to 20% by volume of your compost and put biochar in it, again, it exhibits some of those features I've already said. So it retains the water, so you don't need to water your compost as much and it doesn't dry out as quickly, but it's also adding aeration. It's absorbing the nutrient, so you're not losing your nitrogen, that's off-gassing when you're making a hot compost, for example. You get that ammonia smell. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's loss of nitrogen, loss of ammonia, and that's negative for the atmosphere. So biochar will hold on to some of that nutrient. It also regulates the pH. So biochar is quite alkaline. Generally, when you're making compost, it's quite acidic. So it's actually regulating the pH. It's also providing a microbial habitat. So it's giving those microbes somewhere to live and reproduce and be safe. It also then leaches the liquid it minimizes the leaching. So if your compost is exposed to the rain and it rains a lot, the biochar will hold on to some of that nutrient, and you can also spread biochar around the downside of your compost, as it were. You could make like a bund or a filter, so it would trap some of the nutrient coming out. Because that's the problem in commercial composting, is that when it does rain, a lot of that nutrient leaches out, and then the nearest stream gets that nutrient loading from the compost. So composting operations normally have to dig sort of some kind of pond or something to catch that nutrient, and then that nutrient's just going to slowly off gas into the atmosphere or slowly go down in through the soil profile, and those nutrients are wasted. So you could instead use biochar then to mop that up and then put that back into the next load of compost. And there's other research that shows that you've got improved air quality around a composting system as well, mostly to do with that reduction of the ammonia, but also just, if you're using food waste and stuff that gets a bit smelly, the biochar reduces a lot of those odors and smells.
That's fascinating. So in terms of that compost, once it goes out on the soil, do you think it's the actual nutrients within that compost are actually more effective, or is there a slower release pattern potentially?
Yeah, there should be a slower release, but there will be more nutrient. Because you haven't lost a whole lot of the nitrogen to the atmosphere, I think you're going to have more nutrients in your resulting product. So, yeah, your soil's going to benefit. It's basically making your compost go a lot further and then a slow release, because I think generally you want a slower releasing fertilizer rather than one that releases it all really quickly, and then, the plants have a field day, they grow real fast, and then the nutrient runs out, and then what happens to them? Then they all go yellow leaves and stop growing and want to fall over type thing. So I think a slow release compost is much better. Yeah, I forgot to say also that the research shows that the composting process is actually sped up when it's got 20% biochar in it, mainly because of those things. It doesn't dry out. It's providing a better habitat for the biology and all that. So the composting actually finishes quicker as well.
That's very interesting. Have you come across anyone who is composting, say effluent solids from their effluent pond in a dairy context that are using biochar as well to kind of speed that process up, but also incorporate those nutrients?
Yeah, well, I've actually just recorded a podcast just at the end of last year, and I haven't released it yet. I'm halfway through editing it, so I'm hoping to release it in the next week. They have those barns with a bunker underneath.
Mm-hmm.
So, the dairy animals are in there and they have a bed of straw and stuff like that. But basically then their pee, their urine and their manure is going through to that bunker, and some of the char that is in their bedding is going through with that. And then the owners are also adding biochar into that. It's not, I don't know if it's really a slurry as such. I think it's actually sounds like it's quite dry, but it's quite fungal. And so then they're able to take that out once a year, and it's got the biochar already in there. It's already partly composting, and it reduces the smelling and, the smell in their barns. And they're very happy with it. They've been doing it for, I think, already about a year. So, yes, there's evidence of people doing it. I don't know if anyone's using it in a pond exactly. I'm not sure why effluent's put in ponds, to be honest. Maybe that reason, but yeah, I think when you put effluent in a pond, you're wasting a lot of nutrient because it smells, and if it smells, you're losing nitrogen, right? So why do you want to lose nutrient off your farm to the air? Find a way to get it out back to the land and recycle it, reuse it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, what I'm come across is that effluent is quite more often than not seen as a waste product and not the actual opportunity around the nutrients that it provides. So I think for our dairy industry here in New Zealand, that is such a big opportunity, is to utilise that effluent a lot better and add things like biochar or EMs, effective microbes, to change the form so that we aren't losing as many of the nutrients, and they're in a form that's available to the soil and it's spread across a wider area. I think that is a huge, huge opportunity, and particularly in just keeping that nutrient cycling within that farm system, as you say. So another part that really fascinates me about biochar is, I guess, the aspect of where people are using it as a feed supplement. What are the mechanisms that you're seeing, or through your research, that how biochar actually benefits livestock?
Yeah, I did another huge literature review. The one on compost, one of my other colleagues had done some of that work before me, and so I kind of just finished it off and tidied it up and went back through it. But the dairy one I've just done in November, December last year, I went through all the literature that I could find, and basically my aim was to come up with 10 benefits to a dairy farm of using biochar, and we've published that on the website, and it's available. I've been sharing that around, so hopefully this podcast will bring awareness to it to more people. So the body of research basically indicates that biochar enhances the rumen fermentation patterns. Specifically, it's increasing the concentration of total volatile fatty acids, particularly one called propionate. And this is more energetically efficient as an energy source for the animal compared to acetate and butyrate. So that's getting a bit technical. I'm kind of quoting that from the research that I have done. This shift in the volatile fatty acid profile is consistent with the observed reduction in methane, and it indicates an improved energy harvest from the feed. So if you've got cows that are producing lots and lots of methane, that means that there's basically an inefficient fermentation happening in their gut. Something's not quite balanced there, and they're losing energy. So that means they have to eat more for the same amount of production. So, any tools that we can use to balance that fermentation pattern is beneficial. You wanted the mechanisms. So because the biochar has such an extensive surface area, I'll give you an example. 1 gram of do-it-yourself biochar. This is not biochar necessarily made in a commercial facility, which would be much higher. But if you make it yourself, you can expect 1 gram to have 200 meters squared area. Okay, so 200 meters squared for 1 gram. Now, if you can feed your cow 50, 100, 150 grams of biochar, you're then providing a huge surface area inside their gut that can then get colonized by microbes. And what happens is that colonization includes bacteria that then compete with the methogenic bacteria, and they compete for the metabolic hydrogen. So the biochar supplementation appears to improve nitrogen utilization as well, which reduces the nitrogen excretion in the urine, and it potentially lowers the ammonia emissions from the manure as well. So a cow's burping and farting is like 80% of the methane, and there's a 20% approximately release in the manure. Okay, so it's the burping and the farting that's the worst part, but that can be reduced with feeding the biochar. Another beneficial effect of feeding the biochar to animals is due to its redox activity. So it acts as a geobattery or a geoconductor, because when it's heated over 600 degrees, the resulting biochar has a cation exchange capacity. So what that means is that it can accept and store and mediate electrons. Now, this is getting quite technical, but I mean, we've got to think down to the atomic level, right? So what is happening with biology and chemistry at the atomic level? Because that's what fermentation is about. It's tiny bacteria, and it's the chemistry happening through that fermentation process. Now, when they have biochar in there as well, it can act as a battery, so it can allow electrons to be shifted where they need to be shifted. And again, this is leading to efficiency improvements. Okay, I've got 2 more points for you. Is this getting too technical?
No, it's very good.
Is this the kind of mechanisms that you want to know about?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think it doesn't just apply to biochar. It's actually the understanding of ruminant nutrition, which I think isn't well understood here in New Zealand. And the fact is, if we feed our cows better, they have less of an environmental and climate impact. So it's really important to understand the mechanisms of how biochar helps with that.
Yeah. And the other thing is that biochar is being used, and it's still used because of its high adsorption capacity for a variety of toxins. So, you get mycotoxins, plant toxins, there's pesticides, and there's also toxic metabolites and pathogens. So, tetanus and botulism, which is pretty much in most soil. It's pretty prevalent. It's often there kind of just asleep, or it's not really having an effect, but it's generally everywhere. And if those kind of breed up a little bit, their metabolites, so their excretions, they can be toxic. And so the biochar absorbs those things, and then the animal excretes the biochar through the manure. So it's getting it out of their body. So that keeps them healthier. Now, if an animal's healthier, if it's got better rumination, then it's going to be a happier animal. It's going to use less feed, but it's also going to be happier and healthier. And so it's probably going to breed easier, and it's going to give more milk and better milk. So all of these factors are in the research literature. And so I've kind of put all those together. Unfortunately, there aren't really a lot of studies. That the main ones have come out of Australia. Almost, I couldn't find any in the US. To be honest, I was mostly looking for biochar, and there is another thing called activated carbon. Mm-hmm. And activated carbon is a similar product, but it's made more in a lab under different conditions. So there's still pyrolysis that happens. It's still burn off all the volatiles and get left with a very, very high carbon product. But they use steam injection and I think also sometimes chemicals so that they get a result where the surface area is incredibly high. So the difference between using activated carbon and biochar is basically you just need to use double the biochar to get the same effect. In effect, that's what the reality is. So activated carbon is quite expensive. So I didn't really look at too much of the literature to do with activated carbon because there's no point bringing awareness to a product that's really expensive. The nice thing about biochar is that anyone can make it if they want to make it, or they can then go and buy it from a commercial producer if they want to as well. So I think it's better to give people the whole range of options rather than just put them off because it's going to be expensive and because it's an industrial process as well that some people might not want to be supporting that. Now, the other thing that biochar does for the animal health is that it can reduce or eliminate parasites. Now, the mechanism for this hasn't really been shown in the research that I could find, but there's anecdotal evidence. I've been in contact with Doug Powell in Western Australia, for example, and he has cattle that he has not drenched for 15 years since he's been using biochar as a feed supplement for those animals. So, yeah, it's basically been used a long time. I did find a research from 1936, a German research, where they have used charcoal as a feed supplement and a prophylactic to absorb toxins and to prevent diarrhea and infectious diseases in livestock. So this was getting recommended in the early 20th century. So this was documented in 1936. So we've almost had 100 years of people using char in various forms for animal health, and the general health that is observed is that you get a really shiny coat on the animal, you get bright eyes, and farmers know when an animal is really healthy and happy, right? Like hopefully dairy farmers that are in contact with the animals will know that, and so that has been well documented.
Absolutely. So in terms of like the research that you've done, obviously you had a focus on dairy cows. Did you come across anything for, say, sheep or beef cattle, or I presume venison would have been pretty hard to find as well?
Yes, I was seeing quite a lot of general ruminant research, but I was trying to avoid that because I wanted it to be specifically for dairy cows. But there has been some research done in Europe, but the European trials are often just like with 6 animals and just for like 2 weeks. Yeah. And so I don't think that is actually realistic. So I wanted the trials where they had been done for the whole milking season, or the most recent one I found in Queensland, they were doing it 6 weeks of feeding, and then they were doing the measurements of the results in the last 4 weeks, and they did that 3 times with the same lot of animals. So for me, that logically seems to be that the results then are going to be more useful. So yeah, I did see a lot of Asian research with goats and things like that, so with other ruminants. So well, yeah, the dairy research I've done is definitely going to apply to other ruminants. Dairy is kind of the most specialized, the most valuable animal. So if the research is showing that it's working for them, and farmers are taking the risk of using biochar with them and getting good results, then it's nice that it's then just going to flow down naturally to sheep, beef cattle, goats, alpacas, any other ruminants. Yeah. And it works for horses as well. Horses benefit a lot from biochar as well, even although they're not a ruminant.
No, it's interesting. What sort of rates or dosages would you give to livestock?
Yeah, the research is showing that it's normally 0.8 to 1% dry matter intake, 0.8 to 1%. So that's something between 50 grams to 150 grams for a dairy cow, for example, and it's often given as into the feed ration if they're getting a feed ration during milking, or daily when they're milking. If they're not a dairy animal, then char can be given free choice where they've just got access to it. And if they're not used to eating the biochar, then you might want to mix it with loose salt or drizzle molasses over it or something like that. And then once they've kind of got a taste for it, just putting it out plain is absolutely fine. They normally kind of self-medicate on it, and they go and get some of it when they want it. Going back a little bit to the research for the dairy cows, the milk yield and the fat protein content and all those kinds of things, the results were that I found at least a 2% increase in milk yield. And so that means the payback periods can be as little as 7 weeks for the cost of feeding the supplement. The other study I found in Queensland, they were using powdered activated carbon, and that was getting put into the feed pellets, and it had even better results. I could read the abstract if you're keen, but we could also link to that, and people can go and read that study if they want. It's linked in the article that I've done on the Biochar Network website.
Yeah, I'll put the links in the comments below so people can go have a quick look. So if we are putting livestock through, or putting biochar through our livestock instead of straight on the soil, does it have a different result because it's almost been, fermented through the gut at the same time?
Yes, definitely. If you put plain raw biochar straight on the soil, then it's got no nutrient in it. Okay, biochar is not a fertilizer. It's basically just a high carbon product. So it's got no nutrient, it's got no biology in it. So you can put it out raw, then it's actually going to absorb nutrients from the soil, and it's going to take time to get colonized by biology. Now, in certain situations, you might want that. Again, it comes down to context. Depends what you want it. And you kind of have 3 things you can do with biochar. You can have it raw, you can put the biology in, or you can put the nutrient in, or you can do both. You can put a combination of nutrients and biology in, depending on what you put into it. So if you, for example, want to put fertility into it, you could put NPK fertilizer in if you want. So you could soak it overnight, soak it for 2 days, biochar and water and the NPK. The biochars are going to hold on to the NPK. You could use compost. You could use manure. You could use urine. You could use seaweed. You could use fish. And depending on what you soak the biochar in, you're going to be giving it either biology or nutrients, or a combination of the two. Does that kind of make sense? It's kind of like a wide spectrum. And depending on what you put in, you kind of got to work out in your head, well, all right, how much biology is there in seaweed? How much nutrient is there in seaweed? And that will kind of indicate then what you're doing with your biochar. And you asked about what happens when that biochar that's in the manure is returned back to the soil. Does it change the nutrient cycles? Well, it's inoculated with the biology that was in the gut of the animal. So cows are reputed to have a really great microbiome and are really great for the soil. That's why they're sacred in so many countries, right? So they often are the base fertility of subsistence farming, for example. So we know the biology is great. So it's getting inoculated with all that biology. And then there's the nutrient that's in it as well. So there's the nitrogen and whatever they were eating, some of that nutrients that they haven't absorbed, that's going to go into the biochar as well. And then you're putting that out on the soil, and the cows are doing that for you. They spread it around wherever they poop. And then depending on how your manure is incorporated into the soil, that's going to, again, depend on your context. So a farmer should know, when there's a big cow pad on the ground and they come back 6 months later and it's not there, they should know what's happened to it. So it might be dung beetles, it might be earthworms, there might be fly maggots, there might be other insects eating it, there might be birds coming and scratching it apart, I don't know. Or it might be just sitting there and oxidizing and disappearing and becoming a really hard, dehydrated bit of poo. So depending on what's happening to that will kind of determine how quickly the biochar is then getting in contact with the soil and being incorporated into the soil. I think farmers could be promoting a lot more dung beetles, perhaps bringing them in if they're not there, but also doing stuff that helps their survival. So avoiding the certain sides that are detrimental to dung beetles. And yeah, dung beetles are taking manure down a meter down into the soil profile. So, I think that's the best Earthworms are going to take it down, but probably not nearly as deep as dung beetles. So those farmers that have good access to a variety of dung beetles, yeah, they're winning because they're getting the manure and the biochar put down into the soil profile. And like I said, that biochar is going to be there for decades and decades, hundreds of years. So yeah, really good. Does that kind of answer your question?
Oh, absolutely. So there seems to be a huge amount of benefits, not just for the livestock, but also for the landscapes our farmers are working in. In your experience, what do you think the current barriers have been to the adoption of biochar within their farm system or into a farmer's system?
Oh, that's a tricky one, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know a lot of farmers, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think number one is probably awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Farmers just don't know about biochar and what it can do for their farm. And I think availability is kind of the second thing. There's been a bit of a chicken and egg situation in New Zealand where people that do want to use biochar don't have anywhere to buy it from because the people who are making it don't have customers. So it's a bit of chicken and egg. We didn't have a lot of government funding and support to start up commercial biochar. So there was a lot of do-it-yourself artisanal biochar. So artisanal refers to someone on this, in their backyard or on 5 acres or something like that, making biochar and then maybe selling a little bit of it. That would be classed as artisanal, whereas do-it-yourself is just you do it and you use it yourself. And then you've got the commercial scale where they're making, several tons a day or something like that. But those commercial operations, they take a large amount of investment because those machines are multi-million-dollar machines. So we've had some entrepreneurs do that already in New Zealand and certainly in the US and Europe and Australia. Entrepreneurs have raised funding or used their own money and started up those commercial production facilities. But it's been a bit slow, and we still have a lack of those in New Zealand, for example. There are some coming online that I sort of have heard about probably this year. I know of at least 2 that will come online. So that is a bit of a barrier, is that the availability is just not there, and you can always get it, but you got to pay for it. You got to pay for the freight, and the freight is expensive, right?
Mm.
And I guess then the next thing would be a mindset. So farmers are often not so keen to change because it's kind of working. It's working, and they're a bit afraid to change things because maybe it won't work so well so quickly. Takes time to develop a new technology or a new system, and maybe they're a bit afraid of that, or maybe it's too risky financially. A lot of farmers are in debt, and so maybe they need permission from the bank to try something this new, and it's still classed as new because not many people are doing it. And I guess next there has been negative propaganda against biochar. Fundamentally it's something that you can make and that you don't have to buy from a company. So yeah, some of the benefits we've discussed are actually quite a challenge to certain industries who are making inputs that they sell to farmers. It's a challenge to their bottom line. And so I think there has been definitely some negative propaganda against widespread adoption of biochar. And then the other limiter is that we don't really have carbon credits yet. And that potentially would reduce the cost of it to farmers. If they got paid some carbon credits from maybe a voluntary carbon market where, businesses who are polluting have to buy carbon credits to offset their emissions that they cannot reduce themselves, that money could then pay the farmer who is putting a carbon source into the soil for the long term. That would make it cheaper. But so far we don't have carbon credits available yet. Big companies could do it, but it's a lot of paperwork, a lot of bureaucracy, and a lot of expense. The main issue is that the biochar has to be tested and it has to meet certain regulations and certain standards before the carbon credits will be allocated.
So with that in mind, are you talking about carbon credits for just using biochar, or are you talking in terms of the actual carbon drawdown in the soil?
Yes, it's to do with the carbon sequestration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I presume there are people working in this space in New Zealand. I think the likes of Verdi, etc. And you see overseas there is now people being able to do it with satellites, which I'm not sure how accurate that would be. But I think it is something that's coming to New Zealand, in a space that needs to, like a lot of our profitability and I guess our sheep and beef farms need to account for that carbon credit and that ability to create a carbon sink, because I would say the majority of our pasture-based systems here are creating more of a drawdown than what they're putting out into the atmospheres, particularly in our big open space stations.
Yeah, I mean, this is quite a complex topic, and there's a lot of debate, and I find it quite difficult to figure out what the truth is. And in the day of social media and now the coming AI, it's going to become even more and more difficult to know what the truth is. The whole carbon story has a lot of different players with different motives in it. And so, I mean, the trickiest thing is actually for people to actually agree on, when you put a kilo of biochar into the soil, how much carbon is actually taken out of the carbon cycle. And that's the difficult thing to agree on. And, people argue about that and also, so on. That's why a lot of people just ignore that. And there's companies starting up making biochar and selling it. They don't care about that because that could go on for decades, people arguing and stuff. It's interesting that Australia's taken the path of really promoting a certain type of farming that sequesters carbon in the soil more. Sort of cell grazing and so on shows that the plants sequester carbon through exudates and stuff in the soil. And they've really pushed that way of thinking. But even that has been quite controversial because there's so many different ways to measure, is the carbon in the soil or not. I think with biochar, it's a bit more straightforward, because if it's made under certain conditions out of certain feedstocks, we do kind of agree on the amount of carbon taken out of the carbon cycle, and we do kind of agree on how long it's going to last in the soil. And so it should, in theory, be a little bit easier. But we're also just promoting it anyhow, because there's such a cascade of other benefits for the land and for farmers, and the fact that it's staying there for the longer term, that we should just get on and do it anyway. That's what I reckon. And if the carbon credit bonus comes later, then yes, it'll be a bonus. But I think we should look at the benefits of it in the meantime and do it just because it's got so many other benefits, for the animal health. Just number one, let's stop poisoning animals so much. The drenches aren't even really working. If you have to keep giving a drench to a sheep every month, that's telling you something. It's not working. So let's stop poisoning the landscape and use something else, something a bit more natural. And the other thing I like about biochar is that it is natural. Nature makes biochar through natural fire, and animals have been observed to go into an area that's had a fire and chew on the burnt wood as a self-medication thing. And that's very, very well documented. And we've observed animals doing that for thousands and thousands of years. So let's make the char available to animals.
Exactly. So if we were to try and, I guess, scale the industry in New Zealand, how quickly or how scalable do you think that would be as a biochar industry in New Zealand? And I guess I'm probably talking about it both on and off farm. Yeah,
look, I think that almost any size farm can make their own biochar for feeding to animals. Because most farms do have some trees, right? Like I do cringe when I drive somewhere and I see paddocks with no trees at all. I cringe because the poor animals get no shade and there's no shelter and so on. But in general, most farms have some trees. And so there is branches that come off those trees. Those trees only have a certain life, and then they fall down or they have to be taken down and new trees have to be planted. So there is, I think, naturally a cycle of woody biomass on most farms. And what generally happens with that is it's piled up and then lit around the bottom, often with diesel or something like that. And it's a big, smelly, smoky, polluting mess. We advocate to change that. We advocate to light the pile on top. This is the simplest way to make biochar, right? You stack your pile up with a little bit of consideration. Try and stack it densely. Put some smaller stuff on top, stuff that's flammable on top. Let the pile dry out. We had those vicious winds that came through the South Island. Like a week later, people were trying to burn that material already. A week, 2 weeks. I mean, it's ridiculous. Let the biomass dry out and then make a fire on the top and do what's called a top lit fire. What happens if you light the fire on top is that any smoke that's generated as the heat heats up the stuff underneath the fire, where does the smoke go? It rises up through the flames and the smoke gets burnt. Compare that to making the fire at the bottom of the pile. So you go around the edges of your pile and you light it up. It's got to then heat the wood above it. It starts smoking, but that smoke rises above the fire. It doesn't get burnt. So you have this big smoking mass. So if we can just change lighting it on the top, make 90% less smoke, and then rather than let it burn down to ash, get a water tanker, even a 1,000-liter tote, an IBC on the back of a trailer, fill it up with 1,000 liters of water, and put that fire out. Now, the timing of putting it out is crucial. So farmers are naturally good at observing. So they need to observe the fire as the flames die down. That's when the off-gassing and the pyrolysis is finishing, okay, when there's no more flames. That's when you then put it out with water, and then you'll get a whole lot of biochar. It's really good to do that with a rake because the char kind of self-insulates. If you just put a whole lot of water on top, it will still be quite hot underneath. And if you go away, that heat will then dry out the biochar above it, and it will start burning again. So you really need to get a rake and you need to spread it out quite thin and cool it down until you can kind of touch all the char. But 1,000 liters of water, you can put out a big pile of coals if you spread it out with a rake. And I think that's the simplest way to make char on a farm. You don't need a machine to dig a hole. You don't need any other materials except to stack it up and light it on top and then have a source of water. That should give you enough char to feed your animals, I think, on an ongoing basis. Sure, a dairy farm, they might need to buy a bit more if they've got a huge herd and maybe not so many trees. But the future for me, thinking in a holistic way, in a permaculture way, the future is that we need way more trees on farms. Nature has treed landscapes with grass between the trees, kind of like a savanna. Most of New Zealand was treed and bushed and forested, but a compromise between having to produce food and export food and having it back to a bush. The compromise is to go for a savanna landscape and therefore to have trees basically along every fence line of every paddock, and sometimes maybe do 2 or 3 trees wide rather than just a single row of trees, because the windbreak is far more effective if it's 2 or 3 trees wide. And then in between the 2 or 3 trees, you can have other smaller bushes and other things growing in there. For me, if we're talking about sustainability or regenerative, we need way more trees on landscape. Now, if we have way more trees on landscape, we're going to have more biomass to make char with. You have more char, you put that into the next plantings of your trees, and your trees grow better. So we have a sort of self-improving, self-spiraling on an exponential kind of curve system that gets better and better and better. And let's try and get away from so many inputs, I think. Let's try and figure out how much of a farm's fertility can we get from the farm. And for me, the solution to that is to grow more trees. Now, we can grow fast-growing trees, and we can grow trees that coppice or pollard. So coppicing is when you cut a tree and then it regrows. So most of the eucalypts, some of the acacias, or the poplars, or the willows, and so on, those are coppicing trees, and they've been coppiced for thousands of years again. Those cut branches then can feed livestock. So you've got forage material. They're pretty much all edible. Eucalypts, maybe not so much. But then, hey, use that as your main source of your biochar feedstock. And then the things like willows and poplars that livestock go crazy for, let them strip off all the leaves, strip some of the bark off, pile them up, let them dry out, make your char. And there's other ways to make the char we haven't talked about yet, but we can get into that if you want to. There's more efficient ways, like putting it in a big pile, drying it out, lighting it on top, putting it out. Your yield of your char there is quite low, but there's other ways you can do it where you get a bit more yield, you get a bit more biochar out, but you've got to put in a bit more work, and maybe you're going to get, use some materials maybe.
So if I was a farmer thinking about, wanting to produce my own biochar, you've covered off a couple of the considerations, but what do you think is some other important considerations? Is it the way that they're making it, or is it what sort of material they're going to burn that is really important, that's going to influence that quality or the property of the biochar that's produced on the other end?
Yeah. Well, the first consideration is definitely no contaminated feedstock. So by contaminated, I mean treated wood. Treated wood have, mostly done by CCA, cadmium, copper, and arsenic. Those will stay behind in the biochar, and you don't want that. So no contaminated wood. The same with paints. Paints have heavy metals in them, and the char will hold on to the heavy metals. The heavy metals do not off-gas and get burnt. So we don't want to use painted wood, any painted materials. Also, be wary of other contamination sources such as herbicides, pesticides, and so on. Although generally I don't think people are spraying trees with those things, but perhaps farmers want to use straw or other materials from farm. So if they've been sprayed, then bear in mind that the char can hold on to some of those. Because it's so good at holding on to poisons and metals, because it can be used as its main function, be used as a remediation tool to suck up heavy metals and then collect that char and put the heavy metals in a known place or extract the heavy metals out. So it does do that. And also bear in mind, if you're feeding it to livestock, if you're medicating the livestock, the char could hold on to the medicine or the poison, I guess, if you're doing drenching. The char could interfere with that. So you need to hold off on the char if you're giving medicine or poison, because it might hold on to that and then the animal doesn't get it when it should be getting it.
Mm-hmm.
I talked about lighting on top to reduce the smoke, also dry feedstock. I would say diversity is also good. So if a farmer is going to make biochar, try and use different woods if you can. So prune branches from different trees and put them together and make char from that. Diversity is always better than just using one species of wood. I think that farmers should create a solution that fits their context. So just because you know of someone making char in a certain way, don't necessarily think that's the way you need to do it. I think farmers need to think about their context and then figure out the best way for their context. And that's where the biochar network is important, because in most areas, we have a committee representative, and most of the time their email address or their phone number is on the website. So give them a call, talk to them, talk it through with someone who knows about char, tell them your situation, and then see what their recommendation is. Yeah, I can also talk a little bit more about the feedstock choice. Yeah, the main issue with any biomass is the moisture content. So trying to burn something wet is difficult. It takes more time and it makes way more pollution. So you need to try and dry it out somehow if you can. And generally, if it's wet and softer and more grassy, you're getting more ash. So straw, for example, or grasses, you're going to get quite a lot of ash and not so much char. Bear in mind also that every biomass is going to give you a different char with different properties. Okay. But what is important for a farmer who's making their own char is what's called the residence time. So how long the biomass is getting heated in the pyrolysis process. So you don't want it to just kind of go through real quick, get heated up a little bit, and then come out. You want it to be in there so that it finishes off gassing. That's really important. We're aiming for 600 to 700 degrees. And like I said, when the flames die down and there's almost no flames, that's telling you that the pyrolysis is complete. And I think that's we don't want it too hot. Like if you get it over 750 degrees, so you don't want to force air into your pyrolysis Okay, you could get biochar and try and make activated carbon at 1,000 degrees, but what tends to happen is then the fused carbon rings that I talked about before, they actually then turn into graphene, and then graphene is a different product with different properties, and so you don't really want that. So you don't need to force air into your pyrolysis.
It sounds like there's a few things to consider when you're doing it for the first time. So it's probably good to connect with someone who's done it before, like yourself or someone else within the in the body of people that have set up Biochar New Zealand before going ahead with it.
Yeah. And I would love to see people like yourself, because you're a consultant to farmers, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to get you guys all trained up, and so that you can advise as well, perhaps. I don't know if you think that's feasible, but it's just an idea I've had right now. We need to train as many people as possible. I try and give workshops wherever I'm invited. So, yeah. But there's good resources around as well. There's a lot of YouTube videos with a lot of good stuff. There's some bad stuff, of course, but I could put together a few links. There's a lady called Kelpie Wilson in the US who's got a handbook, and that's a really good resource. It goes through all the details. I was watching a video of hers yesterday, and she's also put it all onto an online course, so you can pay money and do a course. That's now all videos and easy to go through the material and find out what you want to know about. The biochar organization in Australia, that's called ANSBIG, they have produced a farmer's guide to biochar as well, and I think you can buy that on their website. I think it's maybe 40 New Zealand dollars or something like that. It'd be worth spending that little bit of money and then reading through that and just get to know it. And then maybe after that, watch some YouTube videos and make contact with someone on the Biochar network. And by then, if you've done your own little bit of homework and research, then you'll be able to ask the right questions and then propose to that person what you're wanting to do for your context. And then they'll probably go, yep, that sounds like you're spot on, or give you some pointers. Have you considered this? Maybe you should do this. I also like to see more of the quorum sense groups, having field days where they go somewhere and they do some burns and get hands-on. There are some organizations around New Zealand really doing this, but I think we could be doing a heap more. So, yeah, find your local person, invite them and do a workshop.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that sounds like the way. So looking forward, how would you like to see biochar being integrated into farm systems, say, over the next decade?
Like I said, I've interviewed Megan and Daniel Schutt. I don't know if you know them or not. They're in the North Island, and they've basically described how they're using biochar in every way possible. So they feed char to their dairy animals as a feed supplement. I'd like to see all livestock get it, including horses. And by the way, I'd love to see more horses on farms. Let's replace sometimes, or use a horse instead of a quad bike maybe. I'd like to see farmers using it in the bedding, using 20% by volume in the compost. So any farmer, any lifestyler, any backyard person making compost, add biochar in it. I'd like to see filter bags and buns around any sources of nitrogen leaching. So that could be effluent ponds. It could be around the dairy yards, around drains, around walkways, things like that. I'd like to see also broad scale application on pasture and arable cropping land. This couple I'm referring to have actually started, because Daniel's kind of got a transport business. So they've actually launched a new product called lime char, where they've mixed a local source of char with lime, and you can buy that, from 30 litres up to 1,000 litres at a time, and use that as in your fert spreader. You can spread it around on pasture. Although I personally think we should be doing most of the spreading with animals. So get them eating it, get them spreading it. We don't need the fossil fuels then. They are very good at walking around the pasture and pooping it out. And yeah, there's so many advantages to that. And then I'd also like to see it used in horticulture and in nurseries. It's a replacement for peat or vermiculite, perlite, in the potting mix. It holds the water and holds the air just like those peat and vermiculite products do. So I think we should be using it basically throughout all farming and growing industries can be using it. That's what I'd like to see. Yep.
Absolutely. It's got so many benefits for so many different types of farming and growing within New Zealand. Yep. So to finish up, I always ask my guests this one question, which is, what's a force of nature to you?
For me, it's diversity. Nature is so diverse. I think we need to be humble and really try and avoid ego and godlike tendencies. I think we go, oh, we've got this mineral problem, right, we'll just go and apply this. And we think we're like a god, that we're just going to improve the soil all of a sudden. I think we need to step back and let nature figure things out. Let the weeds come sometimes and let them do the work to improve the soil. Get your animals doing the work for you as well. And I guess the second part is that I kind of mentioned it already. Nature creates biochar naturally as well. And so that's why I think it's a technology it's really worth getting excited about and us using it all over the place.
Absolutely. So where can listeners connect with you or learn more about your work?
Yeah, I have a Passionate Permies website. Passionate Permies is a shortcut slang word for permaculturists. And so my wife and I are both Permies, and so we have a little website. I also do a podcast about biochar in New Zealand, and it's called the Char Chit Chat. I've done one season with 20 episodes last year, and so this year I'm into season 2, and I'm hoping to do another 20 episodes. So you can listen to some people I've already interviewed, and I'm going for pretty much anyone and everyone, from someone doing it in their backyard to commercial producers and artists and farmers and all sorts. So I'm just seeking anyone involved in biochar. And so hopefully there you can find an episode that, you resonate with and learn something. And that Char Chit Chat at gmail.com, exactly the same email address if you want to know something about biochar. And the other way is that through the Biochar Network New Zealand, we have a website. I think it's biochar.net.nz. And if you want to enable a little bit more research and more articles and promotional materials to be generated, we need support. We need some funding. We have a lot of volunteers give time, but as you know, you're a volunteer with this podcast. It does eat up a lot of time, and we can't expect really good work to be done always just by volunteers. So we need donations or we need memberships, and we have memberships starting at $50 upwards. And yeah, we'd really appreciate some support. And so you'll see some of my work on that website too. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Dylan. We've covered off quite a lot in an hour or so on biochar, and I feel like we've probably haven't really even touched the sides on how well we can incorporate it into our farm systems here and the actual benefits. So I appreciate you sharing your knowledge with everyone today. It's something that I wanted to learn about myself. So thank you for your time.
Oh, you're welcome. Very welcome. Yeah, we did miss out quite a lot that we didn't really talk about how to make the biochar yourself. But let's perhaps, if you get a whole lot of feedback going, hey, we want to know how do we make it besides just building that pile and lighting it on top. What other ways are there? I could certainly talk for half an hour to 45 minutes on the other basic ways of making it. Some of those I'll outline on the website, so just go to the website. But if you get lots of comments for people asking, I'm happy to come back and answer those questions and have a chat.
Beautiful. Well, that's call out for the listeners. If you want to know specifically how to make it, we can do another episode with Dylan talking about it.
Yep, great. All right, thank you, Conan.